I kept a ledger in those years. Not the station ledger, that was the railroads and it showed nothing but tonnage and delay, but my own, a brown cloth book I bought from the dry goods man the year I came to Harlan Spur and never quite left. I wrote down the things that seemed worth keeping: the first killing frost, the price of beef at the canyon market, the names of people who passed through and the names of the few who stayed. Most of what I wrote was small. Some of it was not. The entry for the 15th of July, 1883 reads, Della Morse, widow, infant daughter. Supply wagon from Tucson. No luggage to speak of. Asked for work. That is all it says. It does not say what I saw when she stepped down from that wagon. The way she lifted the baby first and set her on her hip before she touched the ground herself, as though the child was the fixed point and she was the one adjusting. It does not say that she looked at Harlan Spur in the full midday heat, took in the depot and the two saloons and the feed store and the church with its missing bell, and did not let her face change. I have seen men come off wagons and trains into this country and flinch at what they found. Della Morse did not flinch. She just shifted the baby to her other hip and started walking. I watched her from the window. A stationmaster learns to read arrivals the way a doctor reads a pulse. You see 100 people come off wagons, and you know within 10 seconds which ones have somewhere to go. She did not, but she walked like a woman who was going to find somewhere, which is a different thing entirely. She went to the hotel first. I watched her come back out in under 2 minutes. She went to the saloon, the better one, Kettrick's, and I watched the barman appear in the doorway and shake his head. She went to the church and was in there long enough that I thought the reverend might have something for her, but she came out with the same flour sack she'd gone in with, and the baby still quiet on her hip. She came to the depot last. I opened the door before she knocked. "Everett Purcell," I said. "Stationmaster." "Della Morse," she said. "I'm looking for cook's work, any kind of regular work. I'm told there are ranches east of here." She was maybe 38, though she looked like a woman who had lived past her years in the particular way that the frontier does to a person, not old, just settled deep. Her dress was clean in spite of everything. The baby on her hip had her mother's same gray eyes, watchful and quiet, and was holding a piece of leather cord like it was the most interesting thing in the world. "What happened to your husband?" I asked her. I know it was direct. A stationmaster in a dying rail town learns to be direct. "His debts caught up with him in the spring," she said. "The bank took the homestead in April. He died in May. Heart, the doctor said." I don't argue with doctors. She said it without bitterness, which was the thing that caught me. Not without grief, I don't want to give the wrong impression, but without self-pity, which in my experience is rarer. "The baby's name," I said. "Wren," she said. I thought about it. There were 4 ranches within riding distance of Harlan Spur, and I knew the situation at each one the way you know the weather when you've watched the same sky long enough. The Garvey brothers didn't take women on. The mission station had its own cook. Old Abelson's wife ran his kitchen and would sooner have taken a rattlesnake into it than competition. That left Sawthorne. 3 miles east on the Canyon Road, I said. The Sawthorne Ranch. Man named Calhoun Reese. He's been without a cook since March, when his last one left for Albuquerque. He won't make it easy for you, but if you ask him straight, he'll give you a straight answer. She looked at me for a moment. Is he a decent man? I considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. He's the most honest man in this county, I said. He doesn't say much, but what he does says what he means. She nodded once. Is there a horse I could borrow? There was not a horse available to lend, but there was a mule, and I lent her the mule, and I watched her ride east on the Canyon Road with Wren wrapped against her chest in a length of cotton and the flour sack across the mule's back, and I wrote in my ledger, "Sent to Sawthorne. We'll see." I want to tell you about Calhoun Reese, because you cannot understand what happened at Sawthorne that summer without understanding the man who ran it. He had come to the territory in 1865, 18 years before, A young man of 32 with a new wife named Adeline and $100, and the kind of belief in the future that a man carries like a rifle confidently, without examining it. He built the Sawthorn spread from nothing. The house, the barn, the bunkhouse for the 3 hands he eventually hired, the miles of fence along the canyon rim. He ran cattle and did it well. He was not a man who failed at things he put his hands to. Adeline died in 1875 of a fever that came fast and left faster, taking her in 11 days. His son Marcus was 12. I know this because Marcus told me himself, years later, the way he told it. His father had stood at Adeline's grave in the November cold and then walked back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and not spoken a full sentence for a week. Not from cruelty. From the simple fact that the words had gone out of him, along with whatever had made talking feel worthwhile. He came back to function. He always did. Calhoun Reese was not a man who let the ranch suffer because he was suffering. But something had closed in him, and by the time Marcus was grown and gone to Santa Fe to read law, Calhoun was running Sawthorn alone with his 3 hands and living in a silence so complete that the hands had stopped trying to fill it. He was 54 when Della Morse rode up his canyon road on my mule. I didn't see what happened at the gate. I heard it from 2 sources, from Hector Valls, one of Calhoun's hands who saw it from the barn, and from Della herself much later, when she had the distance to find it almost funny. What Hector saw: a woman rode up on a mule with a baby strapped to her chest and stopped at the gate and called out. Calhoun came out of the barn. They talked. Hector couldn't hear the words, only the shapes of the conversation, which looked to him like a woman asking a direct question and a man standing still and listening to it. Then Calhoun walked to the mule and took the flour sack off its back, and walked toward the house, and the woman got down from the mule and followed him. What Della told me later, she had stated her situation plainly. No husband, infant daughter, no coin, seeking cook's work and lodging in exchange for fair wages, not charity. She said Calhoun had looked at her for a long time, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, but in the way a man looks at a problem he is solving, and then had looked at the baby, who had looked back at him with those gray eyes. And then he had picked up her flour sack without a word and walked toward the house, and she had understood that to be her answer, so she followed. He showed her the kitchen. It was adequate. It was dusty from lack of use, and the stove needed blacking, and the flour bin was running low, but the pots were good iron and the knives were sharp. A man who kept sharp knives, she thought, was a man who respected the work. He showed her the room off the kitchen that had been the cook's, with a narrow bed and a window facing east. He did not say it was hers. He set her flour sack on the bed and walked out. She took it as hers. She sent my mule back with Hector the next morning with a note for me that read, "Employed. Will write when I can. DM." I folded it into my ledger. I had a feeling about it that I did not want to examine too closely because I was not a sentimental man and I didn't want to start. The summer went on. Harlan's spur baked in the heat the way it did every year, slow and relentless, the canyon catching the afternoon sun and holding it like a coal. I ran the depot and watched the twice-weekly supply wagons come and go and wrote my small entries. I rode out to Sawthorn twice that summer, once on station business regarding some freight Calhoun had coming from El Paso, and once because I wanted to see how it was going and was not too proud to admit it to myself, though I told Calhoun it was about a property boundary question that wanted his signature. The first time in late July I found the kitchen transformed. I don't mean by decoration, there was none of that. I mean by use. There was a pot of something on the stove that smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell, and the flour bin was full, and on the table there was a wooden cradle that had not been there before, sanded smooth and fitted with a folded blanket. Wren was in it, awake, watching the ceiling with the philosophical patience of a very young person who has decided the world is adequate. I looked at the cradle. Hector, who had walked in behind me, said quietly, "Boss made it." I said, "When?" Hector said, "Night after she came. Worked on it 2 evenings." I thought about that. Calhoun Reese, in the first 48 hours of having a widow and her infant on his property, had gone to his workshop and built a cradle, not told her he would, not asked if she wanted one. Just made it and brought it in and set it on the floor without ceremony, the way he did all the things that needed doing. I filed that away. Della came in from the yard while I was standing there, carrying a basket of dried beans and moving through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had decided where everything went and arranged it accordingly. She said good afternoon to me, offered coffee, and when I accepted it she poured it and did not hover. She had the quality, rare in anyone, rarer in a person whose circumstances were precarious, of being entirely comfortable in the space she occupied. I asked how she was getting on. Well, she said, and then because she was not a woman who left things imprecise when precision was available. He doesn't talk much, but he's fair. He says what he means when he says anything. I find that easier than a man who says a great deal and means less. I asked if she needed anything from town. She thought about it. Nutmeg, she said, if there's any to be had. I brought her nutmeg the following week. The second time I rode out was in late August, and it was the visit that told me the most. I came around the east side of the barn and nearly walked into Calhoun, who was standing at the fence line looking south, which was not unusual. A rancher is always looking at something. But what was unusual was that he was not alone. Della was standing a few feet away with Wren on her hip, and they were both looking at the same thing, which was a hawk working a thermal over the canyon rim. Neither of them was speaking. They were just standing there together in the late afternoon light, watching the hawk, in the particular silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill the air between them. I stopped. I am not ashamed to say I did not announce myself for a moment. Calhoun said without turning, Everett. The man had ears like a deer. I came up to the fence and we watched the hawk together, the three of us, four, counting Wren, though she was watching something else entirely, a piece of fence post that had caught her interest. After a while Calhoun said, "Freight come in." "Next week," I said. He nodded. We watched the hawk drop and rise. On the ride back to town, I turned that silence over in my mind like a stone you find on a trail that's heavier than it looks. I had known Calhoun Reese for 11 years. In that time I had not once seen him stand still next to another person in that particular way, not the standing near of people who happen to be in the same place, but the standing near of people who have chosen to be in the same place. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. I wrote in my ledger that evening, "Something is happening at Sawthorne. Don't know what it will be, probably something good." What I know of those weeks, I know from Hector and from Della and from my own 2 visits, and I want to be honest that there are parts I am reconstructing from the shape of things, the way you read a river from its banks without having to put your hand in the water. But here is what I believe happened. Calhoun Reese had been running Sawthorne alone for 8 years with his hands and his silence and his grief, which had settled so deep into him by then that he may not have recognized it as grief anymore. He may have just thought it was the shape of himself. A man like that doesn't open slowly. He doesn't sit by a fire and discover, scene by scene, that he is falling in love with the woman cooking his meals. That is a story about a different kind of man. What Calhoun did was act. The cradle, the horse that was always ready in the morning before she'd asked, the broken hinge on the kitchen door that he repaired between one evening and the next without being asked. The afternoon Hector told me this one, when one of the hands had spoken sharply to Della about the coffee being weak, and Calhoun had come in from outside and looked at the hand for a moment, just looked at him, and the man had apologized to her before Calhoun said a word. His code was entirely visible in his behavior if you were paying attention, and Della was always paying attention. She was not a woman who was swept along. Let me be clear about that. She had come to Sawthorne because she needed work and she had found it, and she did her work well, and she was grateful for fair treatment and gave fair value in return. She was not looking for rescue. She did not want to be rescued. She had come through the loss of a homestead and a husband in a single season with Wren on her hip and kept walking. And a woman who does that has a particular relationship with her own competence that does not permit simple rescue narratives. But she was watching him. She told me later, she was watching him the way you watch a country you are considering settling, with attention, with patience, looking for the things that would tell you what it was like in the dry years and the hard ones, not just the good ones. Whether it was honest territory, whether it held. The grave was what told her. Adeline's grave was on the west slope of the Sawthorne property, under a juniper tree, marked with a stone that Calhoun had cut himself. In the 8 years since Adeline had died, he had not, according to Hector, who had been with him 5 of those years, visited it. Not once. He walked past it when he worked the west fence line and did not look at it. In September, Della told me, she had gone to the west slope to gather some dried grasses she used in the kitchen, and had found the grave tended. The ground around the stone cleared and turned. A small bunch of desert marigold in a tin cup filled with water. She stood there a while, she said. Then she went back to the kitchen and made supper and did not mention it. She told me, that was the moment she understood what kind of man she was dealing with. Not a man who had stopped grieving, not a man who had replaced one thing with another, but a man who was finally, carefully, ready to hold both things. The old grief and the new beginning. That he had done it quietly, without announcement, without asking for credit, told her what she needed to know. It was October when the speculator came. His name was Fulton, or he gave that name. I never trusted it. He came from Albuquerque with 2 men and a survey map, and the kind of manner that says a man has had a great many doors opened for him, and has mistaken that for his own quality. He had been buying up small ranches along the canyon for a mining consortium, or that was the story, and Sawthorne sat on the best water in the Eastern Valley, and he had made Calhoun 2 offers already that year, both of which Calhoun had declined without discussion. I know what happened because Della told me, and because Hector confirmed it, and because I saw Fulton ride back through Harlan Spur that afternoon with a face that a man wears when he has miscalculated something fundamental. Fulton arrived at Sawthorne mid-morning. Calhoun met him in the yard. Fulton made his offer. It was more than fair, by the number, more than the land was worth to any honest buyer, and added the thing he had not added before, which was a suggestion that Calhoun might find the property harder to manage in his situation. His situation, Fulton meant, being a man alone of 54. Calhoun said nothing. Fulton pressed. He mentioned the drought that had taken the South grass. He mentioned the freight costs out of El Paso. He mentioned that a man needed to think about his future, and whether what he was holding on to was something that would hold back. Calhoun said, "I'll think on it," which Fulton read as weakness. Fulton had sent his 2 men to look at the south fence, which was his way of spreading the conversation thin enough to make a decision feel pressured. Which was when Della came out of the kitchen door onto the porch with Wren on her hip and a dish towel over her shoulder, and looked at Fulton and his men in the yard with the entirely composed expression of a woman who has taken stock of a situation and decided it is manageable. Fulton looked at her. He recalibrated. He smiled, the kind of smile that is a recalculation wearing the face of warmth, and said something to her about what a fine morning it was. She said, "It is. Are you staying for dinner?" It was not a warm invitation. It was a question with a shape to it, the shape being, this is a household, it has a rhythm, and you are interrupting it. Fulton's 2 men came back from the south fence and looked at the woman on the porch and then at each other and then at Calhoun. There is a thing that happens sometimes in frontier dealings. I have seen it, where the arithmetic of a situation changes in a room or in a yard because of a single person who is clearly not going anywhere. Fulton had come to deal with a lone rancher in a declining position. He had found something else. He declined dinner. He thanked Calhoun for his time. He rode out. Hector told me later that Calhoun had stood in the yard after Fulton left and looked at Della on the porch for a long moment. Then he had said, "You didn't have to do that." And Della had said, "I know," and gone back inside. Hector told me he had never seen Calhoun smile. He had a face, Hector said, that had forgotten how it worked. But that afternoon, after Della went inside, Calhoun had stood in the yard alone, and something had happened to the lower part of his face that Hector, watching from the barn, could not identify but was willing to characterize as a smile. I rode out the following week. I wanted to see Calhoun about the freight, which had finally come in from El Paso, and about the property boundary question, the real one this time, a survey line that wanted his attention before winter. But I will not pretend I wasn't also riding out to see the state of things. I found Calhoun in the barn, working on a harness. He looked up when I came in, nodded, kept working. I pulled up a stool and sat, and we talked about the freight and the boundary and the condition of the canyon road after the last rain, which had taken a section of it out near the 3rd-mile marker. It was the conversation of two men who have known each other long enough that talking is not a performance. After a while I said, "How is it going with the cook?" He didn't look up from the harness. He said, "Her name is Della." That was all he said. But the way he said it, not sharp, not defensive, just a correction offered as a fact that he thought it was important for me to have, told me something so large and plain that I had to look away at the barn wall for a moment and compose myself. I said, "How is it going with Della?" He was quiet for a while, then he said, "She's staying." I said, "Does she know that?" He set the harness down. He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "Not yet." I left shortly after. I was not going to be in the way of whatever was going to happen next. Some things want a station master, and some things do not, and I have learned over the years which category I fall into at any given moment. He told her at the end of October, when the first cold came down off the high country and the mornings turned blue and sharp. He did not say it the way a man in a story says it. Della told me later that he had come into the kitchen before the hands were up, while she was building the fire, and had stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, and I am using her words because they are the best record I have of it, "I'd like it if you stayed on, not as the cook, I mean stayed, permanently. You and Wren, I know that's a thing that wants thinking about, and I'm not asking for an answer now." She said she had kept her hands on the stove and looked at the fire for a moment. She said she had thought about the cradle, the horse ready every morning, the grave tended under the juniper. The way he had not said, "You don't have to do that" to Fulton in the yard, had let her stand there, which was its own kind of statement. She said she had turned around and looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway, 54 years old, a man who had turned his grief into a silence so complete that she had mistaken it for emptiness until she understood it was just where he put things, and she had thought, "This is honest territory. This holds." She said, "I don't need until now." Calhoun said, "All right." And that was that. In the way of two people who have been saying things to each other all summer without using words, and have simply arrived at the point where the words are available, and neither one sees a reason to keep avoiding them. They married in the Harlan Spur Church in November, on a Tuesday, because that was when the Reverend had a window and neither of them cared much about the day of the week. I stood witness. Hector stood on the other side. Wren was in Della's arms and reached out at one point and grabbed the Reverend's sleeve and held it for a moment with great conviction, which the Reverend took as a blessing, and I took as characteristic of her. The ring Calhoun put on Della's hand he had made himself, from silver he'd been given as payment for a horse trade 15 years before and had not spent. I do not know when he made it. I did not ask. Afterward we ate a meal that Della had cooked, which was the one frontier paradox I could not resolve, the bride cooking her own wedding supper, and Calhoun said it was the best meal he'd had at that table. He said it once quietly, like a man who is aware that a thing is true and sees no reason to put ornamentation on the truth. Della said thank you, and did not make a ceremony of it. I wrote in my ledger, Calhoun Reese married November 14, 1883, Della Morse now Reese, infant daughter Wren, Sawthorn Ranch, Canyon Road East, all well. I am writing this, the long version, the real accounting, not the ledger entry in the spring of 1897, from the same desk in the same depot that has been slowly becoming less of a depot and more of a storage room as Harlan Spur becomes less of a town. The railroad moved its main line 12 miles north years ago. I stayed. Some men are fitted for a place and cannot be transplanted, and I am one of them. Sawthorn is still running. Calhoun is 68 and has slowed, but not stopped. A man who built what he built from nothing does not stop. Della runs the kitchen and the accounts, which she always did better than he did, and has put the ledger-keeping on a basis so orderly that the bank man in Albuquerque wrote to compliment them on it, which she read aloud to Calhoun and he said him, which was high praise. Wren is 14. She rides as well as any of the hands and has her mother's gray eyes and her own particular way of looking at the world that is not quite either of her parents. She calls Calhoun Papa, which she decided on herself when she was 2, and which he has never once acknowledged finding remarkable, because he is not the kind of man who acknowledges finding things remarkable, and also because I believe it cracked something open in him that he was not prepared for and has been quietly grateful for ever since. Marcus came back from Santa Fe 4 years ago for a month and stayed 6, and when he left he shook Della's hand and said she had done a better job with the ranch accounts than he had ever seen, and that his father looked well, which was Marcus's way of saying that his father looked like a man who was alive in all the ways that mattered. Calhoun walked him to his horse. They stood there for a while. I don't know what they said. Some conversations belong to the people having them. I think about that July afternoon when Della Morse stepped off a supply wagon with Wren on her hip, and the flour sack over the mule's back and walked, straight-backed and undefeated, to every door in Harlan Spur, until she ran out of doors and came to mine. I think about what would have happened if I'd sent her to the Garvey brothers, or told her there was nothing, or given her the stage fare south out of my own pocket the way I sometimes did for stranded travelers. I would have been practical. I would have been efficient. I would have been entirely wrong. Instead, I told her about Sawthorn and lent her a mule, and she rode 3 miles east on the canyon road and stopped at a gate and stated her situation plainly, and an honest man heard it and picked up her flour sack. I don't know what it is exactly that makes a life. I have been sitting in this depot for 22 years watching people come and go, and I have seen lives made and broken by large things, drought, disease, war, the railroad moving its line, and also by small ones. By a mule lent on a hot afternoon, by a gate opened without conditions, by a cradle built in the dark. What I know is this. There is a woman at the Sawthorn Ranch who asked for work and received a home, not because she was given it unearned, but because she walked toward every closed door in this town until she found one that wasn't, and then she walked in and made herself indispensable to the country and to the man who owned it on her own terms. And there is a man who had turned his grief into a wall so complete that the hands who worked for him had stopped looking for the door, and who turned out, when the right person came along and simply asked for fair work and a room, to have built himself a cradle in 2 days' time. That seems to me like the truth of the thing. I wrote it in the ledger, the real ledger, the one I'll leave when I go. Della Morse rode to Sawthorn on a borrowed mule and asked for honest work. By the first frost she was home. By spring they had already forgotten there was ever a time when she wasn't. That's the whole of it, that's enough.